All right, I see folks are starting to filter into the Zoom room. Hello. Just give you all a few seconds to enter. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan, and I'm an event manager with Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you all to PNP Live. I will soon drop a link in the chat for where you can order a copy of The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, straight from Politics and Prose. You can ask our speakers tonight a question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can toward the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Also, there is an auto caption option for this event by hitting the live caption button at the bottom of your screen. Let's introduce tonight's guests. Kristin Henning is nationally recognized trainer and consultant on the intersection of race, adolescence, and policing. She is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at the Georgetown University Law Center. From 1998 to 2001, she was the lead attorney of the juvenile unit at the Public Defender's Service for the District of Columbia. Awards she has received include the 2021 Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center and the 2013 Robert E. Shepard Jr. Award for Excellence in Juvenile Defense from the National Juvenile Defender Center. Henning will be in conversation with Lisa Lucas, a prominent leader with unparalleled passion. She serves as an essential champion of literature. She was the youngest, first woman, and first person of color to be the executive director of the National Book Foundation. In 2020, she accepted a position to head Pantheon and Schocken Books as the senior vice president. Lisa has been the publisher of Guernica, a nonprofit profit online magazine focused on writing that explores the intersection of art and politics with an international and diverse focus, and the director of education at the Tribeca Film Institute, on the development team at Steppenwolf Theater Company, and a consultant for the Sundance Institute, San Francisco Film Society, and the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards, and Real Works Teen Filmmaking. Please give our guests a virtual round of applause.
So you're.
I am so excited to be here with you today. I was so excited that I forgot to unmute myself.
Excellent. I'm happy to be here too. Thank you, Lisa.
Of course. And so, one of the things that was really exciting, I just started at Pantheon. I'm the publisher of the book, but I inherited the book because it was acquired and edited by Errol McDonald before I even got here. But it's so important to me, and it's so aligned with lots of the things that I've done in my own work over the years, and I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you about it. So I first want to just sort of start. This book is about the criminalization of Black youth in America, right?
Right.
And so there's lots that we're going to talk about. Policing is an issue, the ways that we grow up, how we're perceived differently in our communities and in mixed communities, how schools have police inside of them, and all of the different ways in which kids are not allowed to be kids when they are brown. But I wanted to start first by just talking about childhood, right? And just talking about what it means to be a young person of any kind in the world. And just think a little bit about what play and development and youth really means for any young person, no matter who they are.
Yeah, it's a great way to start the book, to really ground all of this. And really, I think one of the best ways to think about adolescence and to think about childhood is, let me say this. I went for a run just this week on Monday afternoon. Beautiful, beautiful day. It's probably about 4:30. I was running up at a park right up the street from my house, and I looked around the park and there were kids absolutely everywhere. It was right after school, and literally there's a group of kids who are playing tag, chasing each other around. There was, my favorite part of the whole thing is there's a hill, and there were a group of kids who literally were hurling hurling their bodies down the hill, rolling and laughing hysterically. And I was enjoying it immensely, even though I wasn't doing it. There were 3 kids over in one corner sitting on the grass, playing on the phone. There's a group of kids over on my left playing soccer. So it was just this fabulous scene. And because I'm in the midst of, thinking about this book so heavily, I said to myself, what would this scene be like if every single one of these kids was a Black kid? Right. So I live in a relatively diverse neighborhood. My park is pretty diverse, but that day, most of the kids outside were white and just having a ball. That's what childhood looks like that we remember. But I kept thinking, how would we perceive each of those little encounters if all of the kids were Black? We were sitting in the middle of the city at a park. And what I worried about was, right, if the kids hurling themselves down the hill would be considered disorderly conduct. How many people walking through that park would think that the kids sitting playing with their cell phones, were in a gang? Right? How many people would characterize these kids chasing each other and playing tag as assaultive behavior? So, when I think about, childhood, I'm thinking about what we did, what you did. We had fun. One of the things, though, that I'll say about childhood and play is that play is such just a fundamental common feature of our society that we actually take it for granted. But the research shows that play and recreation are essential, right? They're essential for healthy physical and mental development, right? It relieves stress for kids who are, stressed out at school, stressed out at home. It's necessary for physical development. It actually builds social skills, right? When you play and you compete with one another, you learn how to resolve conflicts. You learn teamwork, empathy, all these things that are critically important. So, adolescence is important, and I think we take it for granted. But there's a real value. There's a value to adolescence, and we don't give that same value. We don't give those freedoms to Black children. So
that's play, right? That's really benign. Like, you're worrying about a child in a park. Like, imagine if it was a Black child and they're hurling themselves down the hill. You think there might be some perceived problem with that type of behavior. But what about mischief? Because kids all play and we all accept that. But I was a kid that got into a little bit of trouble. We all got into a little bit of trouble, I would imagine. But how do we perceive the differences in mischief between a child that might be white and a child that might be Black? Because I think that's a real meaningful difference.
Yeah. So, kids will spend their time, they will fill their free time with behaviors and activities that adults don't think are healthy. But again, if we look at the research, we even just think about our own lives, even experimenting with drugs and alcohol, right, can be healthy if it's, contained, doesn't become addictive. Even getting into a fight on the schoolyard might be healthy for a young person to learn to stand up for themselves, to speak out, to have courage, things of that nature. We all know that kids are impulsive. Like you said, we've all done things, right? Impulsive, sensation-seeking, risk-taking. We need to be risk-taking, right? So that we're not afraid. We don't spend our lives afraid and hidden in a hole. So we know this is a natural and healthy part of adolescent development. Sexual experimentation, leads to intimacy and important, feelings that we sustain and need over time. But what I talk about in this book, after setting that up and reminding people just how normal all of these behaviors are, is that Black kids don't have the freedom to experiment in those ways, right? So that if a white child does it, what do? We correct them, right? But we correct them in ways that aren't embarrassing, that aren't criminalized. But if a Black child does any of those things, right, they end up in the criminal system, they get arrested, traumatized, ostracized, excluded from school, all of these things that are really, not only are they normal, but they're healthy behaviors for many young people.
And so in this book, which I have right here, which is beautiful, I should all copy of it. you talk a lot bit about the ways that we restrict play, we restrict experimentation, we restrict mischief, we restrict, all of these things that you're talking about, how natural and healthy and safe they can be within a controlled environment. What does it mean, to take this away, and how, at a baseline, really broad way, are we taking these things away from our children? Society.
Yeah. So, think about, so I focus on adolescence, right? So there's the criminalization of childhood, which is, part and parcel of this. But then there's also like these teen years. And really the adolescent years are the second most important years in our development. Right. Second only to the 0 to 3, age range. And what's so important about the adolescent years is the brain is flexible, right? And that and what that means, it's malleable, it's flexible, but the experiences that we have in these teen years as adolescents really become fixed in our minds, right? So if you label a child, right, as criminal, as bad, as dangerous, letting them believe, telling them over and over again that everything that they're doing is wrong, that becomes fixed in their identity. So it undermines healthy identity development. It also undermines their perceptions of law and law enforcement, since we're talking about the criminal sphere in particular, right? It causes young people to question whether or not it even makes sense to participate, right, in, society as it is, as a law-abiding member of society. What's the point if everything I'm going to do is going to be criminalized, for me? So it's really a devastating time. It's the worst time that we can put a child in jail. It's the worst time, in our development that we could lock a kid in handcuffs. It's the worst time in development to strip a child out of school, right, through exclusionary school discipline practices and the like. And so it's a really critical time to criminalize Black kids.
No, absolutely. And so speaking of law enforcement, right, there's a lot that you talk about in the book about the trauma of policing, and so young people are growing up in these over-policed experiences in their communities, in their parks, in their schools. What are young Black people encountering in these settings in their lives at an adolescent age? You talk a lot about some of the cases that you've worked on and some of the young people that you've worked with, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, so it's pervasive. And it's really, and you sort of nailed it. It's really in every aspect of society, right? So it's a lot of people, know that there are police in schools, for example, and disparate disciplinary practices that infringe upon Black children. But I think a lot of us really miss or not aware of just how pervasive policing and surveillance is in many urban Black communities. And so I have clients who talk about literally looking out of their window and being afraid to go out because they are afraid that a police officer is going to stop them and the like. I have Black children who talk about seeing a police officer, multiple times a day, being stopped multiple times a week, being asked, where are you going? Where are you coming from? Being stopped on the way into a convenience store, on the way out, being asked to lift your shirt so that the officer can see whether or not your waistband, whether you have anything in your waistband. So just think about how pervasive, how traumatizing that must be. You and I, depending on where we live, but many of our listeners, right, take it for granted that I can walk down the street, I can go to my park, and I will not be, approached or impeded by a police officer, in any way, unless, right, there's clear evidence or at least reasonable suspicion that I'm engaged in criminal activity. So this is what they live with. And then they go to school, right? So this starts from childhood, right? So then they go to school and they enter a school that is policed, heavily policed. And the research is clear that children who go to school and predominantly that have a very high percentage of Black and brown children are more likely to have police, right? It undermines the school climate, and the like. And so it's a spillover effect, right? Children talk about schools as being an extension of the criminal legal system, an extension of their neighborhood. So they bring those hostilities with them. So it's really, it's pervasive, and young people see, they really see policing as a form of racism. Right. This is, law enforcement not only enforces the discrimination in every other aspect of my life, but it's uniquely and independently seen as and experienced as a racist experience, and it's traumatizing.
And so you have this perception, right, that this is racist. I shouldn't be exposed to this. This is obviously unjust. There's one moment in the book where I think you're talking about somebody kind of just onlooking, doesn't want to get involved,
right.
Looking at something go down in their community. It's not a school setting, but it's so ingrained that you might not even really want to be in it, but you're still sort of like, let me just take a look and make sure nothing bad happens. So
right.
ingrained. What does that do to a community? What does that do to an adolescent? In your exposures, I mean, obviously there's the sort of injustice of it. You're growing up with the trauma of feeling like something unfair is happening to you, but you're also exposed to an extraordinary amount of risk, because we know that encounters with the police on a regular basis for a young Black child or a young adolescent or an adult, it creates risk. What are those risks of over policing and this constant, many, many encounters in a day even?
Yeah, and let me just that's, such a great question. And literally the conflict, the psychological conflict for Black parents, for Black neighborhoods, for Black neighbors, I should say, all of us, we want to be safe, right? We all want to be safe. And that story, this client who's getting stopped by the police, and it was literally an elderly neighbor, an older Black woman, comes out on her porch and she pretends to be sweeping so that she can watch what's happening. And so she says to the officer, I'm watching you all. I'm not condoning any bad behavior by the kids in my neighborhood, but I need you to know that y'all need to treat him with fairness. And so it just shows the conflict. But what does it do to a community? I think that's it. It's just that. Like, how do we remain cohesive when we've got this conflict? We want to support our children. We don't want crime in our neighborhood, but we want to support our children. And how do we do that? So what I would say, I think about what the risks are, is that I think that the youth police relations, and I think Black youth police relations are at an all-time crisis, at least in a post-civil rights era. Right. So you've got a generation, or now probably, multiple generations of Black youth who have been raised, or Black people who have been raised to fear, right, the police intrusion in their lives and to fear that police brutality. And so I think the tension and the animosity goes in both directions. You've got police officers who are expecting Black children to be dangerous, to be violent, to be hostile. And then you've got Black children who are presuming that the police officers are biased, antagonistic, and going to be aggressive. That is really a toxic, dynamic. And really, the Black children do their best. They respond. They learn to survive in the best way that they can, right? So they learn to adapt their behaviors in order to survive in this over-policed and hyper, aggressive responses to them. And I think if I think it through, really, they probably, that sort of survival takes a number of different forms, right? It takes let me just comply, right? Let me do whatever police tell me to do so I can get home safe. That's one strategy. It's also a psychologically debilitating strategy, right? That I am just going to submit to this, right? Sometimes it looks like speaking back. It looks like talking back. It looks like resisting authority, but we know what adolescents do, right? Adolescents are emotional, they're reactive. We call it adolescent aggressive speech. It may look like profanity, and that escalates. So let's think about how rapidly, and I talk about this in the book, and I think this is really something for people to learn if you're not familiar, but how quickly an encounter with an adolescent goes from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds, right? Kid gets stopped, kid speaks out, and the officer sees that as an aggression, right? And they make an arrest, or there's some sort of physical contact, and it escalates. So that's another category. And then the third category, the third way this survival plays out, is to avoid, right? So Black kids learn to avoid police at all costs. So they see police come up in their neighborhood and they leave. Maybe they take off running. And that's also yet another vicious cycle, right? Because then police officers use that flight or that avoidance as saying, see, I told you you were suspicious. You must be up to no good because, you ran away. So I think the tensions between Black youth and the police really has reached crisis levels.
And the outcomes start to reach crisis levels, right? So it's like there's obviously this idea that we have police in the schools, that are sort of over policing our children. You also have communities that are over policed, creating all this trauma that, goes all the way from the elders all the way to, very small children who are coming up. But then you also have people who are going directly from this over policing into the criminal justice system.
Right.
And then beyond that, we have people who are losing their lives or being physically harmed.
Exactly.
And so that I want to talk a little bit about, the escalation of sort of like being a young person trying to just be a person and facing all of these sort of hostile experiences with people who don't really seem here to help you, who seem here to control you. And then all of a sudden it goes out of hand. How does that happen? And what happens to those young people who end up inside of police custody, end up getting arrested, end up getting charged 5 times? What happens?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to be said about the trauma. You think about what happens, and we're talking about healthy adolescent development and the ways the criminalization impedes healthy adolescent development. A huge piece of that is the mental health, right? And so there is, first of all I have to do is talk to my clients and they'll tell you about their traumas. And so I tell a lot of stories in the book, but I layer those stories with the research. For those folks who, who want to write my stories off as an anecdote, as an outlier, there's empirical research that demonstrates that young people, particularly young Black and Latinx children who have been the target of significant stops and frisk, experience high rates of depression, anxiety, hopelessness, right? Loss, of vision, poor sleep quality, right? Poor sleep quality really is important for so many different levels. So we talk about the school system. So any of you who have kids or we all were teenagers at some point, if you didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, how do you behave in school the next day? You're either sleeping, you can't focus, you have low tolerance, hypersensitive, and the like. And indeed, the research shows that many kids who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods become hypersensitive, really have a pervasive distrust of police officers, but anybody in authority, right? So it translates from police officers to school officials, to principals, and to the like. So one of in my mind, the biggest, what does that do? It's the trauma, that happens. And then like this notion of the how quickly everything escalates, right? So, kids are fairness fanatics, right? Adolescents, by definition, right, are fairness fanatics.
I was very, very invested in justice as a young person.
Yes, of course, right? And look, you said that so well. I was invested in fairness. How many of our kids can say that as teenagers, right? They don't say that, right? And so instead, like we talked about earlier, they talk back and they push back in ways, and particularly so many young people, particularly, I talk about this a bit in the book too, young people with disabilities, right? Young people with language disabilities and the like really don't have the capacity to articulate, like you and I, about how we're feeling. Sometimes they're not even in touch with what makes them so angry and so anxious. And so these encounters become so hostile so quickly. And I have to say, particularly right now, when we're in this post-pandemic era, I have been really worried about kids returning to school. And a lot of the schools have been talking about a trauma-informed return to school. And my biggest fear is that our own biases, our racial biases, are going to make us forget or misinterpret those trauma responses from young people as dangerous or violent, right?
And can't have normal feelings. Black children can't have normal feelings. They have to be some sort of thing that need to be protected, policed, controlled,
Yes.
just being understood to be like a normal response to. I have lots of friends, white friend who has a 10-year-old who's been very upset the whole pandemic and is just sort of freaking out and crying a lot and jumping into bed. Yeah, that's just a normal physical reaction for a young person in the middle of an extremely stressful experience. So imagine a whole community that's already not allowed to do anything.
Absolutely. And listen, let me add to that. So we're talking the pandemic. Also, we're talking about we're in the middle also of the police brutality. Like we're talking the post George Floyd world, right? Where young people, Black youth, have seen this brutality on television, right? So that's that extra layer of trauma that Black children are dealing with. It's a lot. It's a lot. And we have to be patient. And we have to, use the same trauma-informed responses for young Black children as we do for any other kid. That's the key.
And so how did we get here? How did we end up with police everywhere? Why do we have, Black and Latinx families did not say, please send a legion of police officers into our communities to sort of, control and arbitrate every single activity that we do. How do we end up here?
Let's do the history lesson, right? Let's see if we can do the, exactly, right? It's the through line from the era of slavery till today, right? So it starts with what we as a society, I say we, what America had to do to justify the atrocities, to justify the dehumanization of Black children from beginning till now, right? So from the time when Black children were treated as property of the slave master to the civil rights era, when the Emmett Tills of the world are sacrificed, as a symbolic statement, right? That there are limits to Black adolescence, right? And that we will not tolerate integration in our schools, right? And then we and then we think about, again, what do we have to say to justify such a horrific lynching? We have to say that Black children are dangerous, that they're sexual predators, right? So we incite fear, and that's what it's really been about. And then carrying us into the 80s and the 90s, when yet again, politicians, weaponized adolescents in the war on drugs and, the war against poverty, the war on poverty and the like. It's just really the myth of the super predator was used really to demonize and to dehumanize, Black children. And then here's how we get here. This brings us up to today. It's that narrative got so deeply embedded in American society that even the most egalitarian among us, right? Even the most committed to racial equity have deep fears of Black children, right? Deeply embedded fears. And so, and I think that's how, the Tamir Rices of the world then get shot. That's how, if the park scene that I described at the beginning, that's how, an average person who thinks they are, egalitarian and committed to diversity and inclusion could walk through that same park if it was all Black kids and really have a different perception, maybe even be afraid to walk through that park. It's because of those deeply embedded biases and fears that, have been perpetuated throughout history.
We have a language collectively to be like, it is offensive to me race. You have a language for death, right? We have a language for collectively saying this is wrong. But we also are still having this absolutely toxic national conversation about what to do about policing, where you have so many people who are saying, well, I don't want police gone. I want police to take care of my community. And other people saying they're killing us. Right. They're killing us, right? It's like, and every single day, whether it's slowly killing our spirit,
right,
or killing our opportunities, or killing our spaces of play and joy,
right,
development, or literally killing us. What allows our society to even have a debate when it is so obvious statistically, it is so obvious visually, it's so obviously failing. and not actually helping and not actually correcting a problem. It's just doing, I don't even know what.
Right.
Why is this still so hard for white Americans to understand as something that is really, and some Black Americans, all kinds of Americans,
oh, absolutely, unequivocally
to understand that this is problematic, that we are treating our children like criminals.
Yeah, I really think it's short-sighted. We have bought into this real false binary that the only way to keep our society safe is through law enforcement. And that's a social construct. There are alternatives, and especially for children, right? So even if I bring my topic into this little box, especially for children, how do we, raise healthy, productive, law-abiding, if you will, children? There are so many ways. And if we look at the school context, right, we need, alternatives, healthy alternatives for mental health, to ensure the mental health of our children, right? So more counselors, more social workers, smaller schools, smaller classroom sizes, and the like, social emotional learning, right? Teaching children how to resolve conflicts, how to engage with one another. So the point here is there are evidence-based best practices that we could rely on and we could default to. So, it's about reimagining public safety. How do we get to community safety without law enforcement? And we can get there, but we are so stuck in that this is the only way. We have invested money. So there's, tons of reasons, right? Like there's also the, the economic, right? Like the folks who are invested in the industry of law enforcement, the industry of prisons, that's, an impediment, right? There's so many barriers for us just releasing that age-old approach, to public safety.
And then there's also practical, we talked a bit about earlier, not on this conversation, but we talked a little bit about school shootings.
Yeah.
Right. And so how do we draw a direct link between sort of largely white communities experiencing these school shootings over the past, 25 years?
Yeah.
It's been horrific. Right. But how does that translate this issue that, keeps popping up, gun control issue, in my opinion, but the issue keeps popping up. But then all of a sudden, it allows for us to bring police into our schools. So how are some of these issues that have actually nothing to do with over-policing Black children or Latinx children come from these circumstances where we're thinking about collective school shootings? How does that translate to? Because I think sometimes people use those as excuses to be like, well,
yeah. I really learned so much in writing this book about the evolution of school resource officers in schools. And I lived I've been, representing kids for a long time, and I bought into the myth that school resource officers were introduced, or at least significantly introduced, into schools after the mass shooting in Columbine and Sandy Hook and the like. And yes, it is true that the federal government increased funding for police in schools after those incidents. But the reality is that police were introduced into school, and a lot of us know that, but really focusing in that police became a staple in schools in response to Brown versus Board of Education, right? So it was racialized from that moment forward. And police officers were sent to schools, as we all know, under the guise of facilitating, right, integration. But it was anything but. It was to prevent it, right? And you can see, the iconic photographs, throughout the country, fighting and resisting integration, both in the South and in the North, right? I think that history is really important, right? Because all of a sudden, right, so we make it, it's also worth noting that the National Association of School Resource Officers was founded several years before Columbine, right? So that means there was already enough school resource officers from across the country. They had been having national conferences before Columbine. But then Columbine, right, gives the ready excuse. that now we can send police officers into urban schools. And to this day, police school resource officers are far more likely to be in a school with, again, as I said earlier, heavy Black and brown population in urban neighborhoods when these mass shootings, particularly early mass shootings, took place where? In suburban, wealthy, white neighborhoods, right? So it's definitely a racial history that I think we forget. And now it has become an excuse, right? That mass shootings and again, and I hate to say it, I really hope this book causes all of us, Black, white, every race, right? Whatever, even if you're concerned with safety, right? It causes all of us to think about, like you said, how did we get here? And are there alternatives, right? And the how did we get here is important because it's very often used as a police in schools, for example, are used as a weapon of control or a mechanism, a tool, I should say, of control, controlling and limiting Black children. And that's what's critical for us to remember.
Yeah. So I could stay on this issue for
Yeah.
like 2 hours. I could talk to you for 2 hours, 3. But I do want to go on that this book is not just a bunch of statistics about sort of how we got here. And, you're saying all sorts of things that are critically important to our understanding of criminalization of youth and school policing, you name it. But this is a book of stories. It's a book of stories from your own career, cases that you have, been involved with, young people that you've defended, right? And I just wonder how you picked them and some of the ones that you think are most important for people to know. Some of them are just alarming beyond, the things that our young people are going through, the ways, the disparities of treatment within the court system. It's unbelievable. And we can't obviously go through anywhere near all of them here. And I do invite you to read all of these stories because I think that they are outraging in the most important of ways.
Yeah.
But, how did you pick them? And what are some of the things that just, really, have been the most defining for you?
Yeah, so I, for years, so I've been, a public defender. I was at the DC Public Defender Service, as said in the introduction, and before that, so I've been representing kids for 25 years. That's the bottom line. And I have been tracking or keeping a file, an electronic, started off as a paper file, now it's an electronic file of just the most outrageous or disturbing cases that I've had. And so as I began to start writing this book, even 4 years ago, looking on my computer and still just being blown away, like by some of the stories. So I think what I wanted to do more than anything was, so there's several things. One, I wanted to find stories that you could see yourself in as a child. Right. So I wanted, or for you to be able to see your own child in, really that, what does adolescent look like? It looks the same regardless of race, if we just let it look the same. So that was one thing. I think I was also looking for stories that shocked even me, right? So doing this work, you can become complicit, or you can, you forget how outrageous. And then there's that case that just shocks you back to reality. And so like a couple of examples, one, the opening story, the story of Eric is just, a kid being a kid. I hope everybody will turn and read the first page. The very short version of that story is he's a kid who on a Saturday night is watching TV. He sees someone on a movie making a Molotov cocktail. He thinks it's cool, right? He wants to make something that looks like that. And so he runs into his kitchen, he grabs a glass bottle, and he begins to pour all kinds of liquids in the bottle, bleach, pine sol, whatever, right? Liquids that together just simply are not flammable. He grabs a piece of toilet paper. This is my favorite part of the story. He grabs a piece of toilet paper and hangs it out of the bottle and closes the bottle. And all of us know that a toilet paper, you can't, if you light it on fire, it's gonna burn out before it even reaches the top. So there's no way this thing is flammable. He slaps it into his book bag. This is on a Saturday, and he forgets all about it. He goes to school on Monday morning, puts his book bag through the metal detector, and a school resource officer says, "What is this?" He immediately says, "Oh, that's nothing, throw it away." and he goes on to class. Can I just tell you, the police officer, the school called the police, called the fire department, they come snatch him out of class and he gets arrested. He tells them, I wasn't trying to blow up the school. And I think that story is so powerful because it's, I mean, so many layers, right? It's about policing in schools. It's about the fact that they would not give him the benefit of the doubt, right, at all. And then the real kicker of that story is some months later, so they kept him in court for 9 months. You got to read the book to figure out what happens, okay? But a few months later, some months after that incident, I was in Connecticut and I was giving a talk. And I told that story. A white woman comes up to me afterwards and she said, my son did the exact same thing. And I said, what happened to him? And she said to me, they put him in an advanced science class so he could continue to experiment. The radical difference. And for me, I think it was that one of many moments, but that was one of the moments that I knew I needed to keep telling these stories. And that was really, really critical. There are just so many other stories like that. I think, one other one I think it's worth sharing is that really sort of shocks, or I hope will shock the conscious, was about a young client of mine who I'll call Malik. And I always have to be careful because these are real clients. So I have to make sure, I'm like, oh my God, don't say the real name. But yeah, that I call Malik in the book, who literally dead of winter, Washington, D.C., he's going to the metro, right? Coming home from school, coming on the metro, and he's wearing a ski mask because it's cold outside, like all the kids wear, very, very popular, right? And so he had on the ski mask, an officer walks up to him and says, take that off. And so he assumes, just a kid, like he's minding his own business, he's laughing and talking with his friends, he rolls up the ski mask to the top of his head. So it's like a little beanie, because that's what he thought the officer was concerned about, right? And he's gonna keep on walking. The officer reaches out, grabs the hat off his head. What did I say earlier? Teenagers are fairness fanatics, and it was all in. He's like, he reacts physically, and it became in an instant an all-out tussle, on the escalator, where he gets pinned to the escalator. So it's a tragic story. So I pick up this case, right? This all happens. I pick up this case in court with one of my law students, and we're standing there. They read off the charge, and they say he's being charged with wearing a mask or hoodie in public. And I'm like, I've been a defense attorney, I don't know how many years at this point, and I was blown away. I don't even know there's a statute on the books that says that. We raced back to the office to look it up. You know what it was? I bet you many of our listeners can figure it out. It was a statute that was adopted during in response to the KKK marches. They were using, so basically what they said in the District of Columbia statutes was, you have a right to protest, your First Amendment right to protest, but you can't hide your face. So that's why the statute was designed. They were using that statute against my teenage client.
When I read the story, I had to put the book down for a moment. I mean, because how outrageous. I mean, just how outrageous, how outlandish, just absolutely unbelievable. If folks have questions, we're going to move into the Q&A section in just a moment. So please pop them into the Q&A box and we will get to them. I just wanted to ask one more question really quickly before we move to them, and pop them in while I'm asking. This is a short one, but you're teaching, right? You're teaching young people. And, I don't know how different what you teach your students is from your own legal education. What do you think having you as an instructor versus what like when you were in law school?
Yeah.
How do you think that's going to change the way that we think about the legal system in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years?
Yeah, I love that question. I would love to take all the credit and make it, about me and what it's like to have me as a teacher. But no, I think we're in a different place, and legal education does look different. I think in light of so many things, but I think we're at a critical moment in society with, the very public killing of George Floyd and some other very public racial examples of racial brutality. It allows us once again right? And I'm sure if I had gone to law school in the civil rights era, this was the topic as well. But it allows us, again, to really explicitly name this race question and to talk about how race matters, right? So when people ask me about, critical race theory, I'm like, y'all, race matters. Race matters. Race matters in how we write the laws, how we interpret the laws, how we apply the laws. It matters in the institutions we set up and construct in order to enforce those laws. And we talked earlier, Lisa, I said to you about, so many people who are watching take it for granted that they can walk down the street without being interrupted by a police officer unless there's some suspicion, right? They believe also that they can walk away. They have that right to walk away if they do get approached by the police. That is not a reality. For most Black children in America. No reasonable Black child who gets approached by the police thinks that they are free to walk away, right? Because they know that if they walk away, they're going to get, potentially the risk is that they're going to get shot or killed and chased anyway. And if they do try to walk away, then again, police officers will use it. See, I told you, you were up to no good, and that's the only reason you're avoiding me. So that's a very clear, concrete example. And so in our classes, in our clinic, we make race front and center in that conversation. Race matters, right?
Well, thank you. We have a couple questions in the Q&A. So the first one is a comment and a question. It says, the book is phenomenal. It shocked me and made me angry. It also made me want to do something. What can we do to change the ways that this country criminalizes Black youth? What can we do? What can an individual do?
Yeah, so I think that one of the best ways that we can break our biases, so this is for the individual, whatever race you are, it's proximity. Get, in proximity with young people and see and remind yourself that they're just kids, right? So people say all the time, like, I work closely with kids as defender. And even when they're agitated and angry and frustrated, doing all the things, the mischief that, you talked about earlier, you could still see their humanity, right? You can still see that they're just children. And that's about relationships. So that's one, being proximate to young people. Where can I volunteer? If I have that fear walking through the park that I talked about earlier, okay, where am I going to go volunteer? So I think that's part of it. I think it's also, being in conversation with young people and hearing their stories so that we really, really know. I think the individual also needs to be in front of their legislative body. Right? All of us need to, first you got to educate yourself. So starts, I hope, with reading my book, but not just that, but like reading, understanding what's happening, but like paying attention to local spending, local politics, demanding, less police in school or no police in school in favor of these mental health alternatives that we've been talking about. There's so many things I could, everybody can do one thing, right? Here's another thing. And this goes back to my first point. I love saying this every chance I get, that every Black child needs one irrationally caring adult in their lives. And actually Black kids do better by having multiple irrationally caring adults. Can you be that, for someone else? It's usually their parent, but can you be that for folks? But yeah, there's so many more. Chapter 12 has, solutions, ideas about what you can do as an individual, wherever seat you occupy in the country.
I love that you know exactly which chapter number it is.
I know it kind of sounds weird. I started speaking in chapters, but if you read 9.
Thank you so much. That question was from Angela. And then we have another one. What about the impact of dysfunctional, deviant, or abusive home environments when play turns into something inappropriate? How do we address early behaviors that can lead to adverse outcomes?
Yeah. And so, I almost wish I'd saved my irrationally caring adult problem for that answer for that, because I think that's the answer for that, right? So if there's a toxic home environment, there's trauma in the home or in the environment, then what can we do, to provide a safe space, right? So making our schools not an extension of the criminal legal system, but instead making our schools a safe haven, right? For young people and the alike. I also really want to be clear though, and I'm not sure sort of what's underlying the question, but that we know what to do when white kids, have traumatic responses, who grow up in traumatized home environments and do really violent things, right? We have rehabilitative, supportive alternatives. Oh, he must have had a really bad home life. And we treat that as mitigation, and we figure out what to do with kids, both in the legal system or even outside the legal system. It seems like when we have Black kids, right, who grow up in traumatic, poor, violent neighborhoods, we criminalize them too. There's no mitigation, right? It's a dehumanization. We think about, the punishment. We're ready to punish. We're ready to transfer them from juvenile court to adult court, solitary confinement. It's all of the above because they're acting out of their circumstances. So there's a front end answer. How do we intervene as a caring adult? And then there's the back end. When they do something, they react in ways that are harmful to others. How do we respond? And we should respond like we would to a white child.
Yeah, thank you for that. Another question. How effective is the law as a tool to redress the racism that is so deeply baked into the legal system? What are other tools that we can use?
Yeah, it's a great question. This notion of how effective the law is. I like to say that, the law is only a piece. It is really a small piece. Obviously, I am a lawyer, defense attorney, so it's critically important in the work that I do, and it's my focus, it's my tool in the toolbox. But really, to think about the law and reforming the law is tinkering around the edges. That said, it has to be done. So it's got to be like in that example that I talked about, like our freedom, our liberty interest to walk about the street. We need to understand that liberty interest from the race lens. So that's about making sure judges who are interpreting laws and applying laws are applying them from a race-based lens. It's about drafting legislation that is, anti-profiling statutes and the like. It is about adopting laws that are that require or that are only adopted after a racial impact analysis. So there's tinkering around the edges. I think the George Floyd Act would have, had it made it, all the way through, would have been an important statement about police accountability and the like. So law matters, but it's not enough. We need a massive cultural shift. Again, we need to change the narrative. And I think really that's ultimately why I wrote the book, is to make sure, we don't know what we don't know. So making sure, number one, that we really understand the trauma, the day-to-day life experiences of Black children, and then figuring out how each and every one of us switch that narrative, right? So telling their stories, right? Partnering with the media to tell those positive stories about young people. It's a cultural shift that's got to be deeply embedded. It's about checking your own biases so that you're not afraid, so you're not calling 911 every time you see a Black child rolling down a hill. It's all of that, right? But it's a cultural shift, even more than a legal one.
Thank you. And then we have one from Max, who says, what do you think could be the role of restorative justice in the future of juvenile justice? And how can reformers head off concerns about homicide spikes and gun violence by providing alternatives that credibly address public safety concerns while reimagining its operation?
Yeah, maybe I'll do the second question first before the restorative justice question. I think one of the things I just want to say, because I get a lot of questions about violent crime and like, well, what about, what are we going to say about gun violence and violent crime? We definitely critically important question. But one of the things that I say every single time is I want to reset the equation, and that violent crime violent crime among young people is an extraordinary small percentage. An extraordinary small percentage of the reasons why children are arrested and referred to juvenile court. Like the vast majority. There's a statistic showing that only 9% of arrests of Black children involve some sort of violent a person-to-person offense that we're talking about. So one, I like to reset the stage for that as a part of that conversation. The second thing that I like to say is people don't realize that there are also evidence-based, community-based responses to violent crime, right? That are more effective than traditional incarceration, right? Especially for adolescents, right? So there are therapeutic interventions, even with the most violent offenders, right? There are gang interventions, there are violence interrupters, they're credible messengers. There are all of these things that have been proven, they're databases of evidence-based practices for intervention. And so I want people to know that, right? That there are alternatives, right? And we use them on white kids. I urge you to read the book and look at some of the most, I give a few examples of high profile violent offenses by white teenagers. And what did we do? How did we respond? So that's another thing. And then I think restorative justice, restorative justice, I think is an important strategy. It's about building and restoring communities after somebody has been violated. But, even restorative justice can be distorted by our racial biases. Right. And so I think for all of these, we just have to be careful how we use them. But yes, restorative justice is always going to be better than traditional incarceration. It's like sort of in my mind, I don't know if other people would agree, but I think of restorative justice as a sort of the legal sort of like I think of social emotional learning in childhood, in schools. Right. Hopefully that's successful there. But then on the back end, right, when a kid does end up in the legal system, that we have a restorative response. Again, it's all about like learning conflict resolution and learning the consequences or the harms of your behavior. So it's a good strategy, but it's not the end all be all.
All right, I think we have time for one more. And I think the question is, how important is it to model all juvenile courts around a treatment rather than a punishment model?
I think that's critically important. Again, I can't answer that question without doing my little precursor question, is that we've got to do better on the front end so kids don't even end up in the juvenile legal system, right? That we don't even need a juvenile legal system, but it's essential. It is absolutely essential that we have a rehabilitative rather than a punishment model for so many reasons. If we think about adolescent development, right? That the best way to support and correct and redirect an adolescent who's engaged in mischief is through support. It's through positive reinforcements, right? It's through giving them opportunities and, skills and, self-esteem, all of those. It sounds kind of trite, right? But it's not, right? Like it is the best way to help your child is not to beat or punish or pepper spray, right? Like we talk about, brutality. That's not how you would correct your own child by any stretch of the imagination, right? And so that punishment, like incarceration, is the worst thing we can do during adolescence. Punishment, incarceration in particular, is this regimented structure, it's regimented system that doesn't, allow for the brain to develop. Continue to develop in healthy ways. And so incarceration as a form of punishment is the absolute worst for young people. So it's critical. It's really critical.
And the last question is actually my question. This was a lie that was the last one. But so the last question said, thank you for this book and for the work you do on behalf of our Black and Brown children, which I thank you for as well. And I found you to be a very joyful person, writing about a very difficult thing. And so the question is, what tools do you personally use to take care of your own mental and emotional health while doing this work? Because it's so interesting to watch you be so exuberant and joyful and warm and loving. And you obviously do loving, warm work on behalf of children every single day. But there's so much difficulty here. There's so much sadness. There's so much harm. But you managed to maintain, this joyful, positive. How do you take care of you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would start, from, would you say?
But I also wanted to ask the same.
Yes, I see. Right. Look, it's for me. It's I could not do the work if I, weren't an optimistic person. I mean, you get beat down, you come back, you cry, you have nightmares, you lose sleep. It's all of that. And so I think for me, it's a faith walk. Deeply, committed to my own, faith. Having folks in my inner circle who get the work that I do, and get the how, and who care about kids. I probably should have said that first, right? Who care about kids as much as I do, and who understand the pain that, Black children and their families are living with. And so being able to, let's say walk to court and come back, I've been at wonderful places. The DC Public Defender Service, you can come back and you can scream and you can cry and, you can get angry. So that's really important. Faith, optimism, friends who get it, I think are probably three of the most important things. I got to believe there's hope.
Wonderful. And so I just wanted to say thank you for writing this. We talked about a lot, but there's a lot more in here. This is a really important, really stunning work. And I hope everybody here reads it, and I hope everybody here recommends it to a friend. You needn't only buy one copy. And I don't say that just because I'm the publisher. I say that also because it's really, really critically important, I think, to our country and to our youth. So thank you so much, Kristin Henning, for being here, for writing this, and thanks to Politics and Prose. Pick up your copy, and thanks for having me too.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, and on behalf of Politics and Prose, I'd like to thank you both, Kristin Henning and Lisa Lucas, for having this event with us. If you decide to purchase The Rage of Innocence tonight, which we hope you do, please use the link that's in the chat. It'll take you straight to Ms. Henning's book on politics-prose.com. The reason we're able to have events like this is with the support of your book sales at the store. And everyone, we would like to thank our audience for showing up tonight, and we would also like to wish you a good night. Bye, everyone.